we see deficits going up to 10% of GDP, which is very, very high. You have in Australia a public debt of around 6%, and this is in the US and in EU going up to 100%. Imagine what interest you have to pay if your public debt is about 100% of your GDP. This is not about economies that do not work, but this is about governments that have spent too much in the past and about failing efforts to bring this back to balance. So, on the one hand, you see, and that is what I said in the first slide, that we have to reconcile the fragile growth rates on the one hand with the fiscal consolidation on the other hand. So the stimulus continue in some OECD countries, but many governments have announced severe fiscal consolidation measures. And this has to be designed carefully in order not to break the balance. If you go from year 1 to year 2, you stop the stimulus and you have all the focus on fiscal consolidation, then maybe you will damage the growth. But on the other hand, it is very important to design a pathway to get to that fiscal consolidation in order to gain the trust of the markets. Well, sometimes the question is whether or not this fiscal consolidation will affect the growth of these countries in the future. Our impression about that, our expert opinion, is that it will not affect growth significantly because most of these packages are designed in terms of expenditure retrenchment and not in terms of tax increase. The moment that you increase taxes, you will damage growth, or the moment that you let inflation go. But when you do it through expenditure retrenchment, you may do it without damaging the economic growth too much. And there will also be an offset by lower private sector savings and long-term interest rates. Well, going now to the areas where reforms are on the agenda, the first and most urgent area, of course, is the reform in the financial markets. And we have seen now in the United States that some reforms have been announced and implemented. And the United States, of course, is not only is compared to Europe, is in a position that the decision-making can be more coordinated. The federal level, etc., can make easier decisions than the European Union, which is still an aggregation of countries' sovereignties. So it's more difficult, but they will come also. And in the United States, we see that there is a new Systemic Risk Council. It has the authority now to break up US banks in the future if necessary. These US banks also face bars on trading with their own funds and a limit of 3% for hedge and equity funds, for investments in hedge and equity funds. So, on the other hand, the European core banks are doing relatively well. Some smaller banks, like the Spanish Cajas, the Greek banks and the Irish banks and the German Landesbanking face funding stress, but the core banks are doing relatively well. And the Basel III agreement on the financial markets for Europe will set new rules. And we will have also some new institutions more or less in the same direction as the United States. But then our experts give a warning signal not to celebrate the fact that now we control the financial markets with these reforms, because we will never do, as we only can control what exists, and we cannot control what doesn't exist yet. And beyond what exists and what can be controlled, there is always the drive to innovation. And that is how this crisis started, with these derivatives, etc. So some of the explanation was failing supervision, like in California, etc. But some of the explanation was also the new products that were not existing before. And one cannot exclude that new innovation will bring new risks in financial markets. In terms of innovation, in terms of reforms, I have to broaden the picture a little bit from these financial markets. This is not the only area where we need a cleaner world. We also need a cleaner world in terms of bribery and in terms of taxes, closely related, of course, to financial markets, but also to trade and foreign direct investment. We see that anti-bribery rules apply also to business. And this is not only the business in Indonesia or the business in Africa, but it is also the business that has their headquarters in OECD countries. So in the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention and in the United Nations efforts, we try to apply these rules also to the businesses that have their headquarters in OECD and in the United Nations member states. Not only anti-bribery is an area where we need reforms, but also in tax we need reforms, and we need a collective effort to close tax havens. Because what can tax reform bring? What can tax bring? What can tax compliance bring if there are areas in the world where capital can go without being taxed? This has been a tremendous effort in the last years, and in the light of the crisis, there was a lot of sentiment about the fact that in this crisis, it was possible for some countries and some banks and some private persons to have their money on places where it was not taxed. And the whole sentiment around this financial and economic crisis brought feelings like, well, if we have to pay more, all as taxpayers in these countries, where are those companies going that don't pay taxes, huh? And they go even from Germany to Switzerland, which is just one border. It's not always the Bahamas or so. Huh? So there was from Germany a lot of pressure on Switzerland. And there were other pressures all over the world, and this spurred a chain of more tax agreements. And now we had, I think we had more tax agreements in 09, 010 than in the last 10 years before. These tax agreements are not based on international rules, but are mainly based on the OECD tax convention. And here the difference between a convention and a rule is very interesting, because a convention is something that is designed with government experts, but not to be binding, but to set an example that can be followed or can be implemented, and that can be applied voluntarily. And then from there, this tax convention sets models for bilateral tax agreements, etc. Well, international transparency, be it on bribery or on taxes, can really help to spur reforms in these areas. So this is already one lesson, that evidence, transparency, can be a very powerful instrument to make reforms happen and to realize them. Now we go to another area of concern, and an area in which maybe also some reforms are necessary. This is the employment area, the participation area, and in this graph you see that in the years 08, 09, we had an enormous increase in the unemployment rates. You have in Australia like 5%, but in other OECD countries we are up to 10%. In my home country, luckily we have like 3 or 4%. That is also due to some reforms that we introduced before the crisis, while other countries now are discussing reforms after the crisis. But so in the Netherlands we were relatively well off, so are you in Australia. But we see in the OECD area and in the Euro area, on average, a percentage of around 10%. This average of 10% reflects percentages like 3% in the Netherlands, with 20% in Spain on the other hand. And 20% like in Spain is very high, but it is even more of concern if you would know that the youth unemployment in all these countries is the double of the total unemployment. So the average of the youth unemployment is 20, and the actual youth unemployment in Spain is 40%, and in some areas over. So this causes in these countries real tensions. Also in France and in other countries, almost half of the young people are without a job. This is a serious matter. So this brings the challenge of, well, should we stick to the policy of work first? You all know this approach in your constituencies. You know that we have combated employment by the principles of work first, bring them to work, whatever. But we see that now that the challenge is to prevent that unemployment from becoming permanent, and therefore maybe we have to shift to programs where we train first. If there is no work, we cannot say to people, go and apply for a job every 2 weeks, and then after 26 disappointments and half a year you come back, and then we will motivate you to training. One cannot do that. This is unrealistic. So maybe we have to shift to train first programs. But like I said, it is very important that we have direct programs for youth unemployment. Some countries have, like Denmark and France, have special programs already at stake. And then we also have to consider that some of these measures that helped during the crisis should be phased out in order not to damage the growth of the economy. Short-time work permits may help to cover up some unemployment, but if you have short-term work permits with subsidies from the government, and you do that for long years, then this will not be viable, and then there will be a default of these companies in the end, which will not help. And these are lessons from the past that now should be implemented. On the other hand, we see not only the actual unemployment, but also a percentage of 10 composed by so-called discouraged and underemployed people. Discouraged are people who were in the statistics in the years before, seeking a job, but now not seeking a job anymore because they think there is no job anyway for them. So these are people that could enter the labor market but do not seek a job. And this is, of course, a long-term damage to the labor market supply. And the